We want this plate to look silver. We need to work in a gray palette all the way from black to specular white, with gray representing the bulk of the silver component of this plate. I'd like to move the plate down but also give it some shadow, and for this I'm just going to make a copy of this piece right here. I'll just use the option drag method. We're going to fill that with solid black, and we're going to use the appearance panel with a multiply setting, and this we're going to keep at about 50%, so slightly darker and fairly sharp. The rest of the plate, I want to move this on its own layer. I'm going to create a new layer just above the background. So click the Create New Layer button. I'm just going to put in resting surface shadows. I'm going to move that item down. So with it selected, you can see here it's indicated as being selected. I'm going to drag that down, just grabbing the little red target icon, until it moves into the magenta layer called Resting Surface Shadows. Now it's on a separate layer. This allows me then to select the entire plate layer and to move everything, provided of course everything in that layer is unlocked. So it's always worthwhile just to check. You can see here that it looks as if one of these ellipses in a clipping group were locked. So now everything's selected. I just click on it again just to make sure. So I'm clicking on the layer. So click on the target icon for that layer called plate. Now everything in that layer is selected. I can now use my select tool and move this down. I want this shadow fairly sharp, in tight, just slightly offset because of the positioning of the light. And then the appearance panel, we can use an effect, blur, Gaussian blur. Just use a very small blur amount. Now the amount of blur, of course, is predicated on not only the resting surface material properties. If it's a diffuse cloth, like a wool, it would diffuse the light. If it was a very hard, shiny surface, the shadow detail would be very sharp towards the edge. Distance of the plate to the resting surface also will determine how soft the shadow edge is. If an object is further away, we would expect that it would be softer. I'm just going to dial it right down. So it is a sharp shadow, but has a little bit of blur around the edges. So it looks like the plate is at rest on that surface. I could copy that, Command C. I'm going to use Command B to paste the copy behind, and then I'm going to use Option and Shift. Option makes the scaling from center, and the Shift key constrains proportion. And so this is the shadow that would be cast by the upper lip of that plate. I'm just going to offset that, but in this case I'm going to blur it even more. So we apply the Gaussian blur. Because it was a copy, it already has the Gaussian blur in the copy. We just need to increase the blur radius on it. We have two shadows. There we have a very sharp one where the main body of the plate is touching down and casting a very strong shadow, and a secondary shadow that's rather blurry. This is helping us to craft realism. The objects interacting with their environment, either by shadow casting or by reflectance. So it's this next stage, reflectance, that we need to take a look at. In order to make this happen, we're going to be, again, cannibalizing some existing parts, so we might need some copies of things. I'm just going to lock that shadow down. A quick way of doing that is Command 2 or Control 2 on a PC. So this is actually what I want to make a copy of. We'll bring that in later on. I want to create some highlight. You'll notice that with things that are shiny, like silver, that the highlights are specular. They're points of light, and they're very, very strong. The points of light have very sharp edges to them because they are reflecting back most of the light to the viewer's eye. We're going to be adding color and reflections in here, but probably now is a good time for us to position the fruit so that we understand where it's going to go and subsequently where other shadows and reflections need to go. So I'm going to make my apple and my orange visible. Then I'll position them where I feel they should be in that composition. So I'll select the orange layer, I'll move that into position, and I can do some scaling if that's necessary. The entire apple. If the orange were further in the background, I would expect relative to the apple, it would be slightly smaller. So I would just scale that down holding the shift key, and we'll put that there. Now currently they're resting above the rim of the plate, and we need to do a little bit of doctoring in order to change that order up. I'm going to select these two pieces right here. So I'll click down, hold the shift key, click down there, Command C and Command V to paste. Now based on these two things, I'm going to use the Shape Builder tool with the Option key to remove that inside ring. I'm now going to remove this by cutting, Command X, and if I select the apple, which I know to be at the very forefront, I'm going to create a new layer. I can just paste into that layer, Command V. This rim sits in front of the apple. We can see it here as well. So we're going to need to trim some of this off so that we're just showing the forward edge of this. I'm just going to change its color ever so slightly just to differentiate it from what I'm seeing in the background. Maybe we'll change the background color instead. I want to put this in place. I can use what's known as the scissors tool. The scissors tool is located by the eraser, and with the scissors tool I'm going to click here and here, and the same on the other side. And what this does is it breaks the path and it adds two new direction lines. Command 0 to zoom out. I can use my selection tool and click on that piece that I just created. I will use my direct selection tool, click on the blank background, then I can click on that and hit delete twice to remove it. Same with this path right here. Hit delete twice to remove that. It still has a band running through here, and that's because we need to join these two paths up. So let's just zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to use the pen tool, and I'm going to start drawing from here. You'll notice that there's a little backslash next to the pen, meaning that I will continue drawing this line if I start dragging out my direction lines. It's causing the adjacent curve to distort. So what I need to do, just undo this, Command Z, I need to hold down the Option key. This allows me to establish an independently rotating direction line. And it's just a very shallow U-curve here. So I'll drag that with the Option key down, and that allows me to come over here, again with the Option key, and generate that little bit of curve. I'll do the same on the other side. Hold down the Option key, drag out a direction line about a third of the distance, just hugging the curve. And over to here, hold the Option key down, again, about a third of the distance, and try and match it with a tangent to that curve. If I hold the Command key down, I can make little tiny adjustments. There. Command 0 to zoom out, and I have the forward facing portion of that plate that I can use to great effect later on. Now you'll notice there's still a little bit poking out here. That's fine, because I'm going to mask these in the end. Before I do that, I'm simply going to make a copy. I'm just going to hold the Option key down, make a copy of this. I need this to be in front of the apple and the orange. To make that happen, you can see it's active right here. I need to drag it up to this level. Again, I'll just move it down just to about here, where it matches the bottom. I can select this object that I have in the foreground, plus the apple and the orange, and make a clipping mask. But before I do that, I'm going to distort the clipping mask so that it's large enough to enclose both the apple and the orange. So I've got this. It's going to serve as a mask. I also need to select the orange. Now, by creating a situation where I select the apple layer and this gray object, and holding down the Shift key and selecting the orange layer again, make sure nothing's locked in there. Look at this. This would cause problems for us. So I've unlocked everything in that orange layer. I need to select it again with the Shift key so that all objects on the orange layer are selected. They're all selected. Hold the Shift key down. I've got everything in the apple layer. I've got everything in the orange layer selected. And now I can say Object, Clipping Mask, make. You will notice that the clipping mask object, I select it here, there's the clipping group, and there's the clipping mask there. And if I select that, I can grab this top and I can just make a slight adjustment to it so that it hides the edge of the apple that was poking through there. It looks like the apple and the orange are on the inside of the plate, when in fact they're actually above it. The next thing we want to do is figure out where shadows and reflections should appear on this plate. Now it's pretty obvious to me that our apple would probably cast something of a shadow on this orange, and the orange in turn would cast a bit of a shadow on this plate. I just want to make sure that I'm using this as the basis for a clipping path. I don't want the shadows really spilling out too much. With the exception of the orange over here, I'm expecting some of the shadow of the orange to spill out over the edge of this plate. I'll make a copy. I'll make a copy of this object. And a simple way of doing it would be to grab it and just drag it up to in front of the apple. We may have to make some adjustments to that later. I'm just going to put it in that apple layer. And we have that ellipse. There it is. And we're going to use this as a mask for some of the shadows. We can add to this mask later on if need be. I'm just going to distort it by using the Add Anchor Point tool, because I want my shadow in here, but I also want it to be able to spill out over here onto the top of the plate. So I'm going to add an anchor point in there. I should probably add another anchor point in there, and probably another one over here, so that I can start to bend this. I'm just going to go here. I'm going to move this point over here. And you can see that my mask is going to follow the edge of the plate. No shadow will be allowed to spill out over there, but some shadow will be allowed to spill out onto the top surface of that lip on the plate. In addition, I want shadow from the apple to be able to cast possibly up as far as here. So I need to also make changes there. I'll use the Add Anchor Point tool, and I'll add an anchor point in there. I'll add another one in there. Let me just move this anchor point up to right about here. To deal with that, I'm just going to change the curvature again. I want it to be on a tangent, so just move it right to the edge here. I need to use the Option key here to give an independently rotating direction line. So you can see this is going to be my mask. It won't allow shadow to spill beyond this. Now, as far as adding more shadow to the apple, I can do that a different way. I'm going to use the actual apple outline here for creating more shading in that apple. So this is what we've got to go with. We now need to just lock this down for the time being. Maybe even just make it disappear. There we go, and we just got it locked down. As far as creating the shadow from the apple onto the orange, and then from the orange onto the plate, I can simply use a pencil tool. I can just start drawing what I feel is going to be the shadow here, and that shadow is going to run here, and then it might run down to here. And if need be, I can use the direct selection tool, just make some slight adjustments to that. I can use the smooth tool to smooth it out as well. Or if you're good at using the pen tool, just draw it with the pen tool and keep it really simple. So this is going to be the basis of the shadow. Black, appearance, opacity, multiply. Let's go 35%. And we need to establish blur. Blur, Gaussian blur. Just like that. Now you'll notice the shadow is spilling out. That's where the mask comes in. It's going to get rid of that. And I'll just zoom out. So you can see it's starting to help the reality bind together. We're binding these objects in a physical space with a physical reality of light coming at it from a very particular direction. Let's do the same thing here. The shadow for the orange. Again, I'll just use the pencil tool for this. Now I suspect the shadow for the orange would bend up that plate in a fashion sort of like this. And then that shadow would bend down and along. And again, I'm just going to continue this all the way over here, all the way back to the start. And you can see it's already being masked because it's in this particular layer. And I'm going to make that black, multiply, and again, we'll go to about 35%. We'll add blur. I need a little bit of shadow here. So I want to continue working on this shadow that you see here. And let's just zoom in a little bit. And if I look at my layers panel for that, I've labeled this shadow orange. The problem is it's sitting on top of the orange, and I don't want that. I just want to keep the shadowing that I'd already established, because it looks like this is being cast onto the orange by something else. So I just need to select it here. Make sure that it's unlocked, select it here, and before I start dragging it, I need to make a layer just above the plate. I'll select it here, make a new layer. I'm going to call this orange shadow layer. And I just need to drag that same object here onto that new layer that I created. I don't want to put it in the orange layer because it would fall within the mask that is part of the orange, so I need to have it sit below. Now you'll notice that there's no more shadow being cast here, and we have it here. The next thing that I need to do is ensure that the shadow spills over the edge here in accordance with the geometry of the plate lip. Probably the best thing to do would be to make copies of the shadow and make copies of the front-facing portion of the plate. So in other words, just want to make sure this is unlocked. So that's the front lip. Remember, we cut out the back section of it. If we have that, I can copy that, and I can also copy the orange shadow that we had. I'm going to select the shadow, hold down the Shift key, select the front lip, and then hold down the Option key and just start dragging. I can now use this. I don't need to use all of it. I could cut this down, certainly, but I really don't need to. I'll use this forward-facing lip, the copy that I just made, as a mask. Object, clipping mask, make. And you'll notice that it trims out the shadow, and this allows me to move it back into place. And you'll notice that it's actually trimmed off a section at the bottom, which I don't really want. So what I could do with that is just using the scissors tool right here. I simply cut it here and cut it here. This would allow me to delete the portions that I don't need. Select this point with the direct selection tool, hold down the Shift key and select both points, and then use Command J to join those 2 points. This now will allow me to move this back into position, and I'll just line it up like that. And there we have the shadow now running up over top of the lip. The next thing that we want to do is establish some shadow on the apple. And for this, I just simply need to work within this existing path. So we have this path, which is acting as a clipping mask. I can just select that along with the apple, and we can turn that into a clipping group. Object, clipping mask, make. Now because this is a clip group, I can open that up. I could start using my blob brush tool and simply painting in using a black stroke where I felt shadow was necessary in that apple. So I could start from here, then encroach further in here, just like that. And then I need to make sure that I move that creation down inside that apple clipping group so that it is switched off, just like that. I can select this clipping mask. I'm just going to move this down below. I can select the clipping mask, make sure it has no stroke. And now I can select that blob brush element, set the opacity to multiply, 35%, then use the effects menu to add blur, Gaussian blur. I want a fairly diffuse shadow there. So again, I'm just sculpting in shadow using the clipping method and the blob brush and the appearance panel to set opacity and a multiply blend mode of around 35% and the effects menu to create some Gaussian blurring. We've got the shadow of the orange wrapping there, the shadow of the apple wrapping around the orange. Now we need to deal with reflections. It's probably best for us to work with masks and copies of the originals in most cases. I could very easily take this element right here, so we'll just make a copy of that up here. Then I could take a copy, let's just create a layer for now. Create a new layer. I'm just going to put it up here for now at the top, and we'll call that reflections bottom. So these are going to be the reflections that will appear on the bottom of the plate. This object is going to be our mask, and we're going to get copies of not the entire clipping groups, just the meshes for each of the apple and the orange. So I'm going to copy that. I want to make sure I'm in reflections, Command V. Gets pasted in there, and then I want to do the same with the orange. I'm just copying the mesh. Command C, go back up to my reflections layer, Command V, it's pasted in there. And I essentially just want to remove the ocean ripple from the appearance panel on that orange. I can just switch it off by clicking the invisibility there, or I can select the effect and just delete it. So all I have are the gradients that I created originally with my mesh tool. I want to have the objects in a more or less similar situation to how they're composed here, at least spatially. But if I think about how light is going to behave here, it's going to come down, it's going to hit that apple, it's going to then bounce down from that apple and hit some of these surfaces that we can see here, and then those reflections are going to bounce back to the viewer's eye. The thing is that from these surfaces that we're looking at here and down in here, chances are it's not going to be reflecting this stem. It's not going to be reflecting any of this highlight information. It's probably not even going to see this pit area in the apple. It would be actually reflecting a side of the apple that we probably don't even see. So I'm just going to use my mesh tool with the Option key and just start removing some of the unnecessary points in my mesh. Again, this will have the added benefit of simplifying the gradients and make the processing of these images much less taxing. In fact, I could select these points, press I, and have it much redder and quite a bit darker on the far side of that apple because less light would be hitting it according to the way I've set things up. So that might actually be a credible mesh for the apple. With the mesh tool, letter U, hold down the Option key, and I can start to delete some of these things, particularly the highlight information. Not a great deal of that will be reported in the reflection. If the silver surface of this bowl or plate has a sufficient amount of distortion in it, like warps and weaves, bumps, scratches, engravings, and so on, we would expect the reflection to be fairly distorted. And if I needed to, I could imply that by using some of these distort aspects here. So for instance, we could use the wrinkle tool. And that just makes it seem like the surface of that silver is anything but perfect. So these are the elements we're going to use for our reflections. The next thing is to decide on how they might skew if they were bending. they almost skew in an opposite direction to the shadows. That's generally a rule of thumb. So I'll use the shear tool here. Remember, always a good idea to zoom out, spacebar, command option, or control option on a PC. I'm going to click down with the shear tool, and I'm going to move far, far away and start to play with the shearing of that object. I'm going to shear the orange, more or less in a similar direction. Probably both of them would benefit from being scaled a little bit. There we go. And they would drop more or less into this position, below everything else. In order to make that happen, I'm going to have to throw them here. And then I need to select this object, and the easiest way to get it in front of these two objects is to just cut it by using Command or Control X. I'll select the orange and then Command F to paste it in front. I can now select these three objects, and the topmost object is going to be our mask. Object, clipping mask, make. Of course, we will need to position that in such a way that it's inside our plate. So we'll just drop that in there, move it down into position. The items and the reflections right there. We can put it down a little bit, and then we could make this object right here quasi-transparent. Just dial down its opacity so we can see those reflections coming through. There might be a better blend mode. Multiply might be a good one, and drop that down to about 20%. You can see the reflections in there. We could add a little bit of blur to our objects in our clipping group. We'll select the reflection of the orange, the reflection of the mesh, use the effect, blur, Gaussian blur, and just give a little bit of blur there. So about 5 pixels. It just sort of softens that edge. We would do this again here, and probably again up here, because light would be hitting this. It would bounce down and hit the top of this lip and bounce over to the viewer. So the same thing again. We're going to copy the fruits, and we're going to use a masking technique in all of those. We'll just do one more as an example. I'll copy this, holding the Option key down. We could take copies of those fruits, just the mesh. I probably would have been better served to have kept copies of the simple meshes that I had earlier on. Command C. I'm going to create another layer, and we'll call that lip. Reflections on the lip. Select that, and Command V to paste into that layer. U to get the mesh tool, and Option key for the minus sign, and I can just start simplifying the mesh by removing points. Now this would probably be flipped upside down, so we should be mindful of the geometry, and also flipped in this direction. And it may not need a great deal of skewing. Same thing with the orange. Select the mesh object, Command C, go back to the reflections on the lip, Command V. Appearance panel, select the ocean ripple effect and remove it. U to access the mesh tool, Option key to subtract mesh points so that we can simplify the gradient a little bit. I'm going to flip it. So we have these two items that we're going to use and reflect on the lip. In this case, we're going to use this as a mask. We made a copy of that front lip. I'm going to use the shear tool. Make sure I'm zoomed out and start that process. There. I'm going to do the same thing there. Both of these elements, I'm just going to move them up in here. They will be selected along with this copy of the front lip, and we will object, clipping mask, make, and these become our reflections for the top lip. So we're starting to craft very credible looking reflections on a very shiny surface. Again, I just want to make sure these are adequately aligned. You can use blur techniques. Just want to make sure this is in the right place. There's our reflections on the lip. You can open it up, select the individual objects. We could use some distortions possibly, that same wrinkle tool. Now we have some distortions on there, also adding a little bit of Gaussian blur. Other things that we can do, and these can be quite simple. If I select the base of the plate, I can add in a simple linear gradient, which reflects some of this base layer here. I'm going to have to unlock that layer. If we open up that plate layer, we have the reflections. There it is right there. I just want to add a simple linear gradient. So we choose a gradient panel, and I can apply any color I want to it. We'll probably have some blacks and some grays and some whites, but chances are we will have, and I've accidentally applied it to the stroke here. I've got to make sure. I'm just going to drag this to the fill and make the stroke none. And so you can see the gradient there. I should flip it so that the gradient is the other way. So the highlight is over on the right hand side because light would be coming in from there. And then I could copy this to create a central highlight on that plate. And I'm using the Option key to make copies. And then flank it with copies, again using the Option key, and make those flanks. If I get my color palette, I'll switch this to CMYK. And on the flanks of that, we can pick up some of that color that comes off of the background. And again, on the other side of the highlight, select it, change the color to CMYK, pick that up. So we're implying that this is reflecting part of this surface here. And the fact that it's got a strong highlight here tells us that there's a light source coming in sort of obliquely. It's hitting this, which in turn is hitting the silver plate, which is bouncing back to our eyes. So that's a simple solution for that. We could also select the lip here and simply use eye for eyedropper and copy that and maybe slightly offset the gradient. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. While that lip is selected, you'll notice it lines up perfectly, but because it's protruding out further in space, I want the highlight portion aligned ever so differently. So I'll use my gradient tool, and this would allow me to reestablish the gradient with the highlight slightly on the leading edge, like that. I may want to make some adjustments to that, add in some more white right here at this position. Make sure that that is pure white right at that position, and it just gives a very strong highlight. Now, as far as the rest of it's concerned, we would create a reflection in this segment much in the same way. You notice we've already got a piece right here. I could take copies of these reflections and put them in here in the same manner. I'm going to just select copies of the mesh. I should begin really by creating another layer, and we'll call this Reflections Sidewall. I'm going to click on the mesh for the orange, click on the mesh for the apple, copy that, hold the Shift key down, they're both selected, Command C, go up to Reflections Sidewall, Command V, so they're posted in there. They really would require a different perspective, but for this I'm just going to squish them a little bit this way, and I think that will be enough for what our purposes are. I'll just offset them so they're more or less even, and then again I'm going to make a copy of this. I want both of these elements in this region right here. And I need to bring this forward, so if I select it, Command X, select the frontmost object, Command F, and it pastes it in front of there. I can now select all three of those elements, and the keyboard shortcut Command 7 creates the mask. So with that, I can move those into position, and now it's a question of putting them in the right area of the stack. So they need to go down into the plate below the bottom reflections. So I'm just going to move those down. Below there, we can see, we're seeing a little bit of an error here. And so it seems to me that I'll have to create a mask out of this shape right here if I want that to work properly. I'm going to have a very different setup with my ellipse. That and offset that. So if I start with that, make a copy with the Option key. I'll start there. I'm just going to hide that object for now. I'll create another copy down here. Now I can bring back that object that I had hidden. So we have both of them right there. And hold the Shift key down so they're both selected. I'm just going to lock this front lip for now. Command 2. Now I can select both of those elements. I'm just going to move them up for now. And I'm going to use the Shape Builder tool with the Option key just to remove the parts that I don't need. So what this allows me to do now with this object that I've just created is move that down into the reflections sidewall. Just going to drag it down into that layer that I created. This is originally what was set as the mask, and I don't want that as the mask, so I'm going to select it, select the clipping group, and then I need to say release. So if I have that clip group selected, I can say Object, Clipping Mask, Release, and it breaks that binding. I can now delete that ellipse that I didn't want. I can move this back into place. Just move that into position right there. And then all I need to do is select, I'm just holding the Shift key down in my Layers panel, select all three of those things. There, they're all selected now. And I can now say Object, Clipping Mask, Make, or Command 7. You'll notice now that the reflections are actually working. I could probably move that orange over a little bit. Open that up, select just the orange, and just move it over there so we can see it kind of poke through here. Take the entire group again, and we can move it down there. And if need be, I can make tiny little adjustments. I can use my direct selection tool and open that mask up a little bit more, move it down here a little bit more, and make the appropriate adjustments. Again, I could take this, move it over to here, make the appropriate adjustments to the mask, just like that, so it shows. You can see we're starting to construct that reality. You can see that it's not showing any of the red here, it's showing the greener part of the apple up there. I can move that object. So I could select just the apple, move it in such a way that the redder portion of that mesh, like so. Command 0 to zoom out. So we're really starting to craft the look of something silver. We can select areas like this and make copies. So I'm just going to Option drag a section like that and say Object, Clipping Mask, Release. I can delete these extra shapes. Really all I'm interested in is cannibalizing these parts right here. Right now it has no fill. Give it a stroke later on, but for the time being I'll give it a fill. And now I'm going to use Scissors tool. So there's my scissors. I'm going to cut it here. I'm going to cut it here. What this allows me to do is to select just this portion. I'll hold down the Option key with the Direct Selection tool, and it allows me to break this off. And let me just flip the order so it's got stroke. So there you can see the stroke. I'm going to set the stroke to white, and then I could use the Width tool. I could grab that and stretch it out. It's doing it to everything there. I see this is seeing this as a compound path because it was the middle subtracted from a larger ellipse. So for a compound path, to make it stop behaving in that way, I can select it and I can say Object Compound Path Release. So now it's going to behave as separate objects. I'm going to go to my stroke menu and just make sure that the caps are rounded on my stroke. And now I can use that Width tool. Just going to take the Width tool and thicken this up. And then around this bend, I want to thin it right down. Now I've probably got it a bit too thick, but the point I'm trying to make here is that we can use these tools to create highlight. Perhaps that's just a bit too thick. So I'll make little adjustments there wherever those diamonds appear and make the appropriate adjustments. Just from cannibalized part. So I can take this highlight and I could drop that in there just to show that it's kicking some light back. And I could do likewise on the other side. I could probably just flip this and throw this up here. We would expect to see these spectral lights. I would imagine that part of this would have reflections from the environment around it. Perhaps some of this blue wall. We've already put the reflections of the fruit in there, but maybe some of the blue wall. And some kickers or some spectral highlights in white of the lighting that surrounds this. We could select areas like this and use the Mesh tool if we wanted to, or just simply draw things on there. I'm going to try and use the Mesh tool. So if we select that front lip, you can see that this part is currently, I'm going to lock this down. This portion right here, we can add a gradient to it. I'll just put a few more mesh points in there. It looks fairly random. We can take things like that and make it pure white. We can select another point here. Just use the Direct Selection tool. Select another point on that mesh and maybe throw some blue in there because it's reflecting the back wall. And in this way, we can start to fashion the illusion of silver surfaces on that plate. We do likewise. I'm just going to lock that down. Command 2. In areas like this, I'm going to lock that blob brush that created that shadow down. And in areas like this, we can also use the Mesh tool. Now, chances are, if the light's coming from the right to the left, we'd have some strong highlights over here. So we might want to do that. Add in some very strong highlight material right there. Holding down the Command key, that allows me to select a point and then set that to a strong white. And that's allowing us then to start to craft what looks like reflections. With the Mesh tool here, might be able to drop that in, just adding a little red in there for the apple. And again, another mesh point and possibly back to white, or if not white, then at least to some level of gray, because the right hand side would be more in shadow. And this is how we can start to really craft the illusion of reflectance. We could, on top of this, simply use the pencil tool. I could draw some kickers of light in there. You're probably best to study light on these surfaces. I'm going to take this and I'm just going to fill it with a black and white gradient. Or perhaps even make that blue and white. because we have that wall in the background. So I'll make the color CMYK, choose the blue, and then we could choose a variety of different blend modes. You could see what that looks like if we use lighten. Nice. And we'll set that to about 40%. And you can see what that looks like. Again, it's just a pool of reflectance on the surface of that bowl. So you just experiment. Remember, the main techniques are masking, Gaussian blurs, using the mesh tool, creating reflections, using the skew tool to skew those, or the shear tool to shear those reflections, using some of the distortion effects to distort those reflections, and also Gaussian blurred shadows that are masked. You're just layering all of these things one on top of the other in order to create the illusion of reflectance. And we'll just zoom out. We'll get rid of the unwanted cannibalized parts. That's another thing to keep in mind. Just keep a boneyard full of spare parts that will allow you to create highlights, lowlights, masks, and so on. And there you have it. Let me just reset my window, Workspace, Reset Essentials Classic, and there you have a silver plate with an apple and an orange.